Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly live stream. As you know, for the better part of 2020, as we've all adjusted our lives and our work schedules, we've moved most of our events from our wonderful theater here in downtown Austin to remote conversations. One of the benefits of that, in spite of the fact that we love to see you in person, is that we're able to have some out-of-town guests, especially those who've written some important books. And it's exciting for me personally, for all of us here at the foundation, to welcome our friend in the movement, my fellow Louisiana native, and a longtime friend whom I've not yet met in person, although I hope to next week, and that's Rod Dreher. Rod's coming to us today from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He has written many books. He has a recent book that we'll be focused on today. And I just want to let you, the audience, know that number one, as I always say, we're grateful for your tuning in this week and every week. And number two, you're in for a real treat. As I was just mentioning to Rod, while we do cover a lot of hard policy, by hard, I mean hard topics in policy, in this live stream, we also try to have conversations about ideas and topics that I like to say are upstream from policy, in a lot of ways more enduring, sort of the eternal principles. And that's what we're going to be doing today. It's really the context in which those of us who spend most of our professional time thinking about good policy to enact operate. And so it is a distinct pleasure to welcome Rod Dreher, who's the senior editor and writer for the American Conservative, a website I'm hopeful you're familiar with. If not, I'm sure you will be by the end of this hour. As you know, we are going to have a conversation between the two of us for a good part of this time, and then we'll move to your questions in the audience if you have them. But Rod Dreher, thank you so much for making time for this conversation today.
Well, it's a pleasure being here, but I didn't know we were going to talk about my book. I thought we were going to spend the hour praying for the woebegone LSU Tigers.
not from Texas, my friend.
No, it's been we've all through the valley of the shadow of death this year in terms of football. So anyway, it's I guess we can only laugh about it if you're from Louisiana.
Yes, that's right. In fact, as you know, most of my family are big LSU fans, which means that last year was very difficult for me. Once your Tigers came to Austin and beat us en route to a great championship run, what a terrific team they were.
Well, the Lord chastises those he loves. So
yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so as my son was asking me, he said, "Dad, don't you want to make fun of these same folks who were making fun of you last year?" And I said, "Philip, there are two problems with that. The first is LSU went 15-0 last year and won a national championship. And the second problem is my Texas Longhorns are not much to be celebrating this year." Well, what a great start. Yeah, what a great start, Rod. The really important things in life are not policy or even elections, but college football. So what we're going to do today is dive into your book. It is called Live Not by Lies, using a phrase from a hero we share, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whom we discuss, as you might imagine, fairly often on this live stream. And the subtitle is A Manual for Christian Dissidents. Why don't you tell us, before we get into some of the individual components of the book, Rod, what inspired you to write this now?
I got a phone call back in 2015 from a physician in Minnesota whose elderly mother, lived with him and his wife. And earlier in her life, she had been a political prisoner in Czechoslovakia, her homeland, thrown into a communist prison in the 1950s for practicing her Catholic faith. And she told her son, the things I'm seeing happen in America now remind me of what it was like when communism first came to my country. And it scared her son, so he felt like he had to tell somebody. Well, when he told me that, I thought, this seems pretty alarming. Maybe she's just an old lady who watches a lot of cable news and is getting scared. So I made it my point, or my project, to whenever I would travel around this country and talk to people, give at conferences or meet people who had grown up under Soviet communism, I would put the question to them: are you seeing things happening today in America that remind you of what you left behind? Every single one of them, they all say yes. And if you push them further, they would get really angry that Americans don't take them seriously. Well, what are they seeing? They are seeing the emergence of some sort of an ideology, not necessarily coming from the state, though partly from the state, but an ideology that silences people, that makes people afraid to speak what's really on their minds for fear of losing their jobs, of being shamed publicly, and so on and so forth. And eventually, what I did after I heard this from enough people, I decided to write a book about it. And not only is the book a form of diagnosis, but also I traveled to Russia and to some of the former Eastern Bloc countries and spoke to Christians who had endured this, some of whom went to prison, and to ask them for their own advice about what we should be looking for here and ways that we can prepare ourselves to be part of the resistance.
Yeah, that's well said. This has come up quite a bit for many members of our audience, some of whom I know personally, many of whom I get emails or phone calls from since Election Day. And what they would say is, even though they know that the world does not begin and end with particular elections or particular political candidates, we certainly don't think so as a nonpartisan think tank, even though we're unabashedly conservative, is that this election and the questions surrounding it, but perhaps some of the media coverage leading up to it, not just for a particular candidate, but for people who are conservatively minded, was sort of the last straw, is the point for many members of the audience. In other words, what you've been writing about for years, what I might mention to these same folks, having spent a lot of time in higher ed, battling the academic left, they have finally seen an example in the election. And so I think there's a real opportunity with the thesis that you're making to convince some people who've been sort of with us philosophically, but maybe a little dubious, that the problem is as bad as we've been saying. So how would you encourage them to continue their own thinking that's evolved, that this in fact is a problem, this intellectual tyranny of the left?
Well, I would point out that this is not a problem that can be solved only by politics. It's not to say politics isn't important, but we have seen wokeness, as they call it, the social justice warriors. We have seen this sort of thing rising for many years. Rene Girard, one of the great 20th century intellectuals around the year 2000, he was teaching at Stanford. He saw this happening, and he said that this concern for victims, that is one of the most noble things about the classical liberal tradition, and of course Christianity. The concern for victims is important and good, but it has become an end in itself, and it has become an ideology that is leading to totalitarianism and a permanent inquisition. Those were his words. But I have seen, to my great frustration over the past decade or so many of my fellow conservatives who think that it's okay if we just get a Republican Congress and a Republican president, this stuff will stop. Well, look, I think it's important to have a Republican Congress and a Republican president, but some of the worst of what we've seen has happened under President Trump. Now, I don't think this is his fault, but it just shows the limits of what politics can do when the ideological left have taken over so many institutions, and especially in our society, the institutions of capitalism. That, I think, is one of the major turning points in this this slow revolution. It's when big business went from being neutral in the culture war to being affirmatively on the left. And that also happened in 2015, by the way.
No, it did. And a couple of points as I come back to this comment you're making about woke capitalism, which is an interest of many people who watch this live stream every day. The first is that we often use the metaphor. I did as we opened the conversation about ideas and philosophy being upstream from politics. Doesn't mean that politics or particular political parties or elections or candidates are unimportant. It just means that we really do need to be mindful, especially as conservatives, of these important things that are upstream. And so, to continue with that metaphor, winning particular elections, having presidents that we as conservatives are very grateful for, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump in my lifetime, speaking for myself and probably for many audience members, those are great. They're important. We hope to have more of them, but we cannot, they're individual boats. I like to canoe and kayak, so I'll think about a small boat. They're individual canoes or kayaks, but they are in the current of whatever the stream or river we're in, that being the culture. And I think as conservatives in 2020, we've learned our lesson, or I hope we have, that we really do have to be mindful of that. And so to come back to woke capitalism, what are some of the symptoms of this problem that people as conservatives used to think that corporations were more virtuous than the government. I think we've learned that that's decidedly not the case. And many examples, and by corporations, I mean the mega corporations that are more interested in globalism and even shutting out, I think about the oil and gas industry, independent producers, because they really are nagging at their market share. What's the diagnosis there? Why has that happened? And secondly, what do you think a solution or two might be?
Well, I think the main reason it has happened is because the people who run corporations come out of the same social class as the people who run universities and who run media corporations. And one of the things that has really I've learned over the years of working in media is that it really does matter what the elites think. I remember when working in mainstream journalism, people outside of journalism had the idea that, oh, if all journalism, all the big newspapers care about is making money, and well, that's really not true. I saw it when I was at the Dallas Morning News for years on the opinion page, that the people at the paper were even in management were they didn't care mostly about money. The business model was collapsing, but they really and truly cared about being virtuous. And for them, being virtuous meant being on the progressive, on the left. They were business Republicans. And so I would point out to people that the corporations, as I said earlier, are run by people who went to the same schools as the liberal elite that run other institutions, and they want to be respected by them too. Plus, we've seen an entire generation. I'm Generation X. I'm 53 years old, but the millennials and the post-millennial generation are people who, for whatever reason or set of reasons, expect ideological correctness from the business that they do with people. So it's not enough for them to see business as neutral. They see it as having inherently a moral purpose, which, from a Christian point of view, there's something good there, but they're seeing it entirely from a leftist point of view. So this is how we end up with things like Halliburton, when Dick Cheney's old company, inviting in one of the Nicole Hannah-Jones, who founded the 1619 Project, which I think is a tissue of lies meant to delegitimize the American founding. But there she is being invited in by one of the great American companies to give lectures. I mean, it's just nuts. What can we do about it? Well, I think that we have to influence and pressure our legislators to be mindful of and to defend the rights of employees within these corporations not to be fired for their private viewpoints. It is happening so often, over and over and over, that the same thing that we hear about universities, that people are being driven out, professors for being not being woke, it's also happening in major corporations. I hear it all the time. In fact, when I was in Poland last year doing research for my book, I ended up talking to some Polish Catholics who are working for the Polish branches of Western European and US-based multinationals, who said that they were being forced to participate in LGBT pride celebrations within the workplace, even though it violated their consciences. And they felt that they couldn't say no to it without, they'd have to resign their jobs, and their families depended on them. This is the kind of decision that no American and no one anywhere should have to make. So I hope that our legislators, our Republican legislators, can make an argument for classical liberal principles and not judging people and forcing them to choose between their livelihood or their consciences.
That's really well said, and for all of you in the audience, I told you that Rod would do a great job of intersecting these ideas that are upstream to policy. And I just want to put a fine point on that. Here, Rod, in a month, our Texas legislature will convene as it does every other year. Because it meets only every other year, there's a lot of gravity to each of these sessions. And the Texas Public Policy Foundation, as a leading conservative think tank in Texas, puts together a list of legislative priorities. And there's one of them that is directly relevant to what you just mentioned. In fact, I'm going to read a very, very short passage of your book that's relevant. This is about woke capitalism. It's what we were just talking about. And this is about the energy industry, important to all of us, even if we're not directly in it. You and I appreciate it, given where we grew up. But this is what you say. In his 2018 letter to investors, Larry Fink, CEO of the global investment company BlackRock, said that corporate social responsibility is now part of the cost of doing business. Fink writes, society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. The Texas Public Policy Foundation helped lead an effort of I think, several hundred people who signed a letter to Mr. Fink about this, saying the positive contribution to society that corporations, most of them very small, relative to say Walmart or Apple serve, is making a profit, which is not, and it's not an evil or illegal thing. In fact, if they're making a profit, and especially if they're a small or mid-sized company, they're probably serving a very good purpose. The point to connect all of those dots is that we realized here in Texas that we needed to advocate for a new law that would forbid any company doing business with the state of Texas from investing in companies like Mr. Fink's that are much more focused on environmental social governance than they are what we understand as capitalism. The final caveat I would make is, by saying that, and I know what you believe on this, we're not looking for some sort of unfettered capitalism. We're of course wanting and expecting that people engaged in the free market to be virtuous. It's just that we have this cabal, I would submit, between government folks and woke capitalism folks.
Yeah, well, what constitutes a positive contribution to society? That's the rub right there. They believe that the entire progressive social agenda, that is what is positive in their view. And this really burst out in 2015 in Indiana, the state of Indiana, where the Republican legislature and Governor Mike Pence at the time passed a state version of the federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which would not have guaranteed that religious plaintiffs, if they're sued for discrimination, it wouldn't have guaranteed that they would win in court, but it would give them an affirmative defense. When that happened, major corporations like Apple, Salesforce, Eli Lilly, and others came down like a ton of bricks on the state of Indiana and said, if you don't repeal this bigoted legislation, there will be an economic price to pay. And they weren't kidding. Of course, Indiana did repeal its legislation. A week later, Walmart, similar legislation was in front of the Arkansas legislature. Walmart cleared its throat. It was gone, this legislation. And that was a major turning point because it was the first time that big corporations had gotten involved at that level in the culture war. And in a liberal capitalist democracy like ours, when that happens, it changes everything. And to connect this to something else I talk about in my book about what's happening in China with the social credit system, the Chinese state keeps a file on each one of its citizens, an electronic file, giving them a social credit rating, which is to say, how reliable are you? How much are you committed to making a positive contribution to our communist paradise? They don't have to send the police over or put human eyes on this data. What the Chinese do is they hoover up all this data from the cell phone use, from the laptop use, from every interaction each Chinese citizen has with the economy, and it's almost a cashless society, so there's constant interactions. And they run it through their algorithms, through their artificial intelligence algorithms, and they come up with a score. If you're doing things the state considers to be positive, a good positive contribution to society, you have a high score. And that would include things like downloading the speeches of Xi Jinping. But if you do things the state considers to be antisocial, like going to church, and they know you've been there because they follow your GPS, or meeting up with people the state considers to be deplorable, well, then you're going to have a lower credit score. Everybody can see your credit score. And if you have a lower credit score, you lose privileges. You won't be able to get the good jobs. Your kids might not be able to go to the university. You can't travel, and so on and so forth. So this is an ingenious way for the state to monitor everybody and to reward people who are conformist. So what does this have to do with the woke capitalism we were talking about? Well, in our country right now, the state, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't gather this information as it does in China, but this data are harvested by major corporations, by Google, by Amazon, by all of them. And if they wanted to assign a social credit score to any of us, They have the data. It has been harvested legally, completely legally, and all they need to do is to act on it. I think that this is how it's going to ultimately come to us in the years to come. This soft totalitarianism. They won't do it for any openly malicious sake. They'll do it to make society better, to reward people who are pro-social, and to punish people who are antisocial. Well, I think we all know who the antisocial people are going to be. But the key thing I want to say here is this is one reason why we Americans find it so difficult to imagine that there is a totalitarian system coming to us, because our idea of totalitarian is formed by the Cold War. So we think of Stalin's Russia, or we think of George Orwell's 1984, where the powers that be would enforce conformity by inflicting pain and terror on people. That's not what's going to happen here. With us, it's going to be much more about manipulating social status and professional opportunity for the sake of forcing conformity, and that's why we don't see it coming.
Well, that's right. It's that we're all frogs in the proverbial pot of boiling water, and I think to underscore one of the points you make, you're not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not. It's not what we engage in here at the foundation. But it starts to sound like a conspiracy theorist when we just relate the facts, as you just did, and that's unfortunate. That's the conclusion that some people make. Those people who make those conclusions, this is the point, are in many of the same media organizations, or speaking from that same platform of woke capitalism. A good point for us to remember is that it's not just our government we need to be worried about regarding some of the collection of this data. It's our major global mega corporations who possess this, whether it be Amazon or Walmart or some of the other tech companies. They're sitting on a massive consumer data, which they use to market to us better, helps them be more profitable to some extent. As you said, it's not evil intrinsically. I just get concerned when we look at all of these threads over the many years that this soft tyranny is something that we as Americans are particularly vulnerable to.
Well, then this is why, let me just jump in real quick.
Yeah, you bet.
This is why I took it as being alarmist when this elderly Czech woman said that she's seeing things happen that remind her of communism. Come on, really? But when you talk to these people, they've been through it and they can feel it in their bones that something is happening. And if you talk to enough of them, you realize, you know what? These people are canaries in the coal mine, and we had better start listening to them.
Yeah, that's right. So thank you for that response. We'll get to audience questions here in a moment. But before we do that, Rod, I'm just curious what you might say to the question, why and how? I mean, we've sort of focused on what's gone on the last 10 years or so, but what do you think are the roots of this in American society that we would be seeing it now in 2020?
Yeah. Well, it has been building slowly for a long time. I think that this is its roots are in the idea of progressivism, on the idea that the ultimate goal of society is to make people more equal and the individual more free. Well, you can't. There's an inherent tension between egalitarianism and personal individual liberty. But I think what's happening as our society since the 1960s has become more and more secular, we've lost the idea that we determine right and wrong by the narrative that has come down to us through the Bible. And not only through the Bible, but through the American founding, these basic classical liberal values. As we have detached ourselves from those and from the idea that there is a transcendent truth outside of ourselves that we can know and through which we have to judge our own actions. And rather, we have come to see the sovereign individual self and the desires of the individual self as being the center, at the center of our politics. Inevitably, it becomes this sort of thing where we want to control people's lives for the sake of freeing up the individual. It's a paradox, but James Polos, the cultural critic, conservative guy at Claremont Institute, he calls it the pink police state. He says that we've got to a place where, and this is especially true with the younger generations, where people will be willing to surrender important political liberties like freedom of religion and freedom of speech in exchange for security, People want to feel that somebody's going to take care of them and they will never have to be offended by anything. And if they have to give up free speech and the things that are part of classical liberal society for the sake of the government keeping them comfortable and keeping them safe from having to be offended, well, then they're willing to do that. This is extraordinary. And I think I have to believe that it can't be detached from the loss of Christian faith within American society and the rise of what the scholar Philip Reef in the 1960s called psychological man, which is to say a person who believes that the ultimate good in life is to be free of anxiety. There's a fantastic new book out by a man named Carl Trueman. He's a scholar at Grove City College who talks about this, how we got here and how we got to the place where we ceased going after virtue and organizing our lives and our common life according to a certain set of virtues. And rather, we decided to do this to organize society around dealing with the anxieties of the individual. I'll tell a very quick story before we go to questions. When I was in Budapest in Hungary researching this book, I was traveling on a tram through the city with my translator. She's a young woman, a Catholic, maybe 30 years old, a mother and a wife. She's been married 4 or 5 years. And she told me, I don't understand, Rod, why it is that I can't talk to any of my friends my age about the struggles I have as a mom and as a wife. Because as soon as I began to talk to them about it, the first thing they do is say, oh, get a divorce, put your son in daycare, go back to work. Do what is best for yourself. And she said, I want to tell them that I am doing what's best for myself. I'm happy being a wife. I'm happy being a mom, but it's just hard sometimes. But they don't understand the point of struggle. Well, I looked at my friend and said, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's it. Well, where did you get that? Well, I pulled out my phone and went to chapter 17 of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is the more important dystopian novel of the 20th century for what we're facing now, more important than 1984. And in that chapter of the novel, the anti-hero, John the Savage, meets with Mustafa Mon, the world controller. And rather than torture him, Mustafa Mon says, why don't you want to be part of this society? We offer you, his words, Christianity without tears. In other words, we'll make you completely comfortable. We'll give you all the drugs and sex you want. You don't have to worry about anything. Why would you not want to be part of it? And he says that he wants freedom. Freedom is more important to him. I would suggest to the listeners here that we have gotten into a society where where pleasure and status, maintaining pleasure and status in our culture today is more important to most Americans than liberty.
Yes, that is really well said, and that's a concern of so many people who tune into the audience. And speaking of them, Rod, we'll start turning to their questions. I have a couple more questions I'm going to ask you, but I really want to get to their questions. So if you have a question, you're in the audience, just go to the comment section of the social media channel you're using and type it in there, and we'll try to, with the time we have, to get to your question. But the first, Rod, from one of our audience members is, I'm going to reword this slightly for clarity, about critical race theory. And how can we avoid this training toward critical race theory, using critical race theory, especially on people in left-leaning states?
Boy, that is a massively important question. And I don't know that we can avoid it in the short term. I'm aware right now at Smith College, there's a young woman named Jody Shaw. She's an employee there, and she has spoken up against critical race theory training on the grounds that it makes her as a white person feel unsafe and attacked. And I think that this is ultimately going to end up in a lawsuit, and it's going to ultimately end up at the Supreme Court. But what do we do in the short term? I think that some people are going to have to decide: do I go through this training and affirm the things they asked me to affirm? Will it violate my conscience to the extent that I have to resign my job in order to maintain my integrity? There will be some people who are like that, but I would say that if you can't go through this, just ask questions. Ask the instructor the kind of questions that undermine what they're doing. And it's easy to find people. This one guy I like to follow a lot, James Lindsay, Lindsay, on He runs a site called newdiscourses.com. He's an academic who has made fighting critical race theory one of his real passions. You can go to James Lindsay's site and read his stuff, and you can come up with questions that you can put very, very peaceably and very respectfully to your trainers that will disrupt what they're trying to do. The problem with that, though, is you have to be prepared to be hated by the people around you and to be targeted by the people around you. And you have, before you raise your objection to it, you have to be prepared to ultimately lose your job. In my book, I tell the story of Václav Havel, the leader of the Czech dissident movement and the first president of a free Czechoslovakia. He tells a story, he made it up, of a greengrocer, the putative greengrocer under communism. He runs a store in a city, and everybody has to put up in their shop window a sign saying, "Workers of the world, unite," the Marxist slogan. What happened, said Havel, if one day the little greengrocer said, "I don't believe this, and I'm tired of going along to get along," and he takes the sign out of his window? Well, the government comes to him. They shut his store down. He loses his job. He loses so many privileges. Maybe his kids can't go to college, and so on and so forth. But what has he done by refusing to go along to get along? He has shown that it is possible to defy the system of lies that the whole government, the entire system is built on, defy those lies, and to survive with your integrity intact. If you are willing to suffer individually, you can strike a blow against the system. And if enough people do this, they see his example, the system will fall. I'm afraid that we're going to have to cultivate within ourselves the courage of a Havel's greengrocer and start saying no and forcing these people to fire us and then taking it to court in order for it to stop, because they absolutely, the elites believe that this is virtue. I think it's stone cold racism, but they believe that this is virtue and they're prepared to fight for it.
Yeah, I tell you, it's a troubling example, but one that ought to stir us to action. Speaking of that, we have an audience member who has kind of a piggyback question to this one. You offered some constructive ways, or ways that we can go about pushing on this agenda constructively. And this audience member says, what are some other examples of how we can respond to these attacks in a constructive way that kind of helps to build support?
Well, I'll tell you, I dedicated the book to the memory of Father Tomislav Kolakovic. Father Kolakovic, who died in 1990, was a Croatian Catholic priest. In 1943, he was doing anti-Nazi work in Zagreb when he got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him. So he escaped and went to Slovakia, his mother's homeland, adopted her last name, Kolakovic, and began teaching at a Catholic university there. Now, again, this is 1943. He told his students, he said, listen, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is when it's over with, the Soviets and their puppets are going to be ruling this country. And as communists, the first people they're going to come after are we in the church. So we've got to be ready for it. What Father Kolakovic did was organize small groups for prayer, but also study and to debate how they could prepare for this long suffering that was coming. And they would do things as simple as sometimes debating how do we resist an interrogation. This was, again, during the Second World War. The bishops of Slovakia chastised him and said, you're being alarmist, it'll never happen, stop being that way. But Kolakovic knew the communist mindset because he had studied for missionary work in the Soviet Union. So Father Kolakovic's family, as he called it, these groups spread all across Slovakia. Each town of any size had a group that would come together to meet and talk and pray and to talk about what we can do as Catholics to resist what's coming. Sure enough, when the Iron Curtain fell in Czechoslovakia, they kicked Kolakovic out, and the first thing they did was come after the church. Turns out that Father Kolakovic's network became the backbone of the underground Catholic Church in that country and became the only meaningful resistance to communism for the next 40 years. I dedicate my book, Live Not by Lies, to him because I hope to help my fellow Americans, and not just Christians, but all Americans, to see the dire threat to our liberty that we're facing and to inspire us to come together like Father Kolakovic's groups and to figure out what can we practically do to prepare ourselves spiritually and intellectually, but also materially for what's to come. One thing I hope that people will do is to start forming networks of material assistance. So when people within our groups lose their jobs for the sake of principle, that they'll know that we have their back, that we can help them get other jobs or help take care of them materially through, so we can make it easier for them to make the choice to sacrifice their jobs for the sake of principle. There's all kinds of things we can do, because the kind of totalitarianism that I think we're facing in this country is going to be substantially different from what the Czechs and the Slovaks faced. But the key thing is to do as Father Kolakovich did, see it coming, and start forming these networks of trusted people right now. Another thing that I would say, and this is one of the things that really troubles me, society is going cashless. More and more, we're going cashless. In China right now, it's almost entirely a cashless society where people use their phones to do all of their shopping. It's incredibly convenient. But here's the thing, if you don't have cash, then all of your transactions can be monitored and controlled. All it would take to kick you out of the economy and make it where you cannot buy or sell is for somebody basically to flip a switch. I think that this sort of thing is ultimately going to be coming here to this country. And the more we go cashless, the more likely it is to happen. I know it sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory, except it is actually happening in China right now. So what I would love to see is people who are more economically minded and more practical minded to come up with ways to circumvent that. So if any of us do get shut out of the economy for not being woke, that we will have ways to continue to feed our families.
Yeah, that's really important. And I always try to work into these conversations kind of next steps. I may not know exactly how to implement it. You may not, but surely someone in our audience may, and I bet that will motivate someone. This concept of networks of material assistance will motivate.
It's creativity. We have to work together, because all of us, we have different gifts, but that's how the underground church did it too. And the dissident movements, they brought people together of different gifts to collaborate for mutual aid and support.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, throughout the book, especially one chapter towards the end, that we in the West, we in the United States in particular, might learn more, we might learn better how to fight this particular kind of soft tyranny from the East than we will from the West. I think that's very telling.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
One other thing I'll observe before getting to another question from the audience, Rod, is kind of mentioning this for the audience, that what I love about your book, among many things, is how you've organized it. You've got it separated into two parts. The first, what people would expect, I think, which is a diagnosis of this soft totalitarianism. But very importantly, for those of us who are always looking for solutions, you have a second part, which you've entitled How to Live in Truth. And my favorite chapter in that, probably because it does give some great practical ideas, is chapter 6, Cultivating Cultural Memory. Just curious if you might briefly summarize for our audience what you mean by that.
Well, all totalitarian regimes, in order to extend their power over people, try to erase history in the minds of people, so they can form the cultural memories, which is to say the things that we remember in common, so that the revolutionary regime can give us new memories, so to speak. And I tell a story in the book about Karol Wojtyła, the future John Paul II. When the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, it was impossible for people to pick up guns, Poles to pick up guns and fight the Wehrmacht. But what young Karol Wojtyła did, he was an actor. He and his friends came together and wrote plays about Polish history and about Catholicism, because they knew that in order to subjugate the Poles, the Germans were going to try to destroy all cultural memory of Poland as a nation and destroy their religion. So what Wojtyła and the others did, they would come together quietly underground to perform these plays for audience members. If the Gestapo had heard about any of this, everyone would have been killed. But they knew that this was the most important thing they could do to resist, to remind Polish people who they were. In a similar way, as we found during the whole communist years in Czechoslovakia, for example, dissidents would hold seminars in people's houses where they would talk about not politics, because that would have gotten them all arrested, but they would talk about literature, they would talk about art, to keep the memory alive in the people there of what it meant to be a Czech or a Christian or a member of the West. Sir Roger Scruton was instrumental in helping and bringing help from the West to these brave people so they could hold their seminars. This is something we see now in our country in, for example, that classical Christian school movement. My children go to a school like that here in Baton Rouge. It's run on a shoestring, but these kids are learning the Greeks, they're learning the Romans, they're reading the great books. And this is reminding them who they are. So when they grow up here in a society that tries to demonize American history and Western history, they have in their moral imaginations the resistance built in. In Prague, this is in the book too. In Prague, I talked to this woman, Kamila Bendova. Her apartment, she and her late husband Václav were leaders of the dissident movement in Czechoslovakia, and her husband actually went to prison for 4 years for his work. But their large apartment in central Prague was they hosted these seminars back under communism. And I asked Camilla, I said, Camilla, how did you and your husband raise your 6 kids to be Catholics under communism when the Catholics were persecuted? And after communism fell, the Czech Republic is the most atheist country in Europe, but her kids, they all grew up to be faithful Catholics, and they're raising children themselves as faithful Catholics. She said, Rod, I would come home from work every day and I would read to them for 2 hours a day. I said, really? She goes, oh yeah. I said, what would you read? She said, I read to them myths. I read to them the classics, and I read to them Tolkien. I said, Tolkien? Why Tolkien? She looked at me in the eye and said, because we knew that Mordor was real. And she said she wanted their kids to understand what was happening, the movement that their parents were involved in, and all their parents' friends. It was just like what Frodo and the others were doing to fight evil. And but that was a way that the kids who couldn't understand anything about communism, but they did understand the quest. They did understand Frodo. And so the lesson here is to pour into our children. It's not enough to tell them what's wrong with the world. These are the bad things. You have to do that, but you also have to pour into their moral imaginations, feed it with things that are true, good, and beautiful.
And that's what's lacking. What a wonderfully thorough response of many practical solutions for us as parents, maybe grandparents tuning in, but also just as a people. We can't love what we don't know. And the fact that American civics, American history have been attacked very intentionally by the left. I saw it because I taught civics and history. All of that is very intentional, and we're seeing the rotten fruit of it. So one more question from the audience, and then I'll ask you a final question to ask all of our guests. This wonderful question from the audience member is taking your concept of soft tyranny and thinking about current events, in particular, not just the reality of the COVID pandemic, but the more controversial side of that, which is some government responses. And so this audience member asks, do you believe some governments have exploited the COVID crisis toward the goal of the soft tyranny?
Yeah, I think without question that is happening and will happen. I don't want people to understand me as someone who denies that COVID is a crisis. It really is a crisis, but it has also been an opportunity. I mean, we've seen the Great Reset from the World Economic Forum. I mean, that when you look at some of the things that are being proposed there, it almost seems like a joke. It seems like some right-wing conspiracy theorist idea of what elites would do if they had the chance. But guess what? It's real. I mean, this whole COVID year has been an apocalypse in the literal sense of the term. The word apocalypse is Greek for an unveiling. Well, what it has unveiled is the weaknesses in our society, but also it has unveiled the way that certain elites are working to make it something that they can control. And I feel weird talking about that because I do fight with some of my friends who don't think COVID is a big deal. I think that's absolutely wrong. I've known people who've died from it, but it's also the case that we have to figure out a way to respond meaningfully to the actual threat that's there without giving elites the excuse they need to get more control over us. So the whole contract tracing thing, this is a way that it makes sense from a public health point of view, but it's also the sort of thing that I believe will get us more and more acculturated to being monitored at all times. But I want to point out too that this is something that is not just COVID related. So many people, like tens of millions of people in this country, have an Alexa device in their house, from Amazon, and it makes life so much easier for them. But I just would say to them, like, look, if somebody from the government showed up and said, we want to put a speaker in your house that will listen to the things you say, and it'll make your life easier in some ways, but it will also record some of your conversations and send those recordings back for storage somewhere. Would you take that? No, you would slam the door in the government agent's face. But if it's coming to us sold as consumer convenience from a private company, we're happy to put it in our houses. Camilla Bendova, the woman I just talked about, she was sitting in her apartment in Prague, and she told me she does not understand why Americans, but also young people in her country, are so willing to be free with their data to allow others to gather it. She said, Rod, nobody gathers this data for an innocent reason. People tell themselves, oh, well, I'm not guilty of anything. They'll never use this against me. Camilla said they'll always find a reason to use it against you if they want to get you. And then she pointed in her apartment to scars on the wall and the paint where she and her late husband had pulled out the wires that the secret police had put in their house to surveil them. They tore them out after the fall of communism. And Camilla said, you cannot be naive about information, that it will, if it's being put away somewhere, that all they have to do is take it out and they will come up with charges against you. This is the sort of thing that, whether it's COVID related or not, that we have to be mindful of.
Yeah, that is what a reminder. So, Rod, as we look at the top of the hour here, where we'll wrap up, I want to ask you a question, ask all of our guests. The conversation's been fantastic, so thank you. And that is, 2020 has been challenging to say the least, whether the reality of the pandemic, the controversy of the shutdown, a very difficult election year. Nonetheless, I think many of us wake up each day and we're grateful to wake up in the United States. And so I always ask our guests when we have time, what hopeful thoughts would you leave us with? Why are you optimistic this day in spite of some of the challenges we're facing?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful. And I'll tell you the difference. And I got this from the people I talked to, who some of whom had seen the darkest days of the 20th century from their prison cells, but they had hope. And their hope was in God. And the hope was not only in God in general, but in the Christian God. And their Christian faith told them that it said that even if things go badly, that there's deep meaning there if we unite our sufferings to Jesus Christ. And because optimism itself is shallow, because things might not go well. I mean, look, the Christian faith is a faith of martyrs. And in the communist countries, not a single one of the people I talked to believed they would live to see the end of communism. But they believed that it would be defeated someday because it was evil and it was based on a lie. So they were willing to accept the suffering that was put onto them and stand against it, no matter what their tormentors put on them, because they believed that God would ultimately use it for the good. There was a man, I tell them his story in the book, Dr. Sylvester Krčmery, who was part of the underground church in Slovakia. And he said that when he went into prison, he knew the first thing he could not let himself do was feel sorry for himself, because if he felt sorry for himself, he would collapse. He saw his entire prison experience, 10 years, as an opportunity to serve God and to serve other people who were suffering. And that was his hope. That's my hope too. I don't know when COVID is going to be over. I don't expect things to get better in terms of soft totalitarianism in my lifetime, although I hope it does. But I do know that if I and the people around me keep our faith and realize that whatever suffering we have to do for the sake of the truth, it is something that God will ultimately use for the good and for our redemption. So not optimism, but hope.
Yeah, very good distinction. I'm sure our audience appreciates that. Well, Rod, thanks for a great conversation. Most of all, for all of the work you've done for many years. Your new book is Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. I'm sure you and the audience can find that anywhere you look for new books. You also should go to theamericanconservative.com. I think one of the great places to read not just news, but really thoughtful, in-depth analysis of the news. Rod is the senior editor and writer there. My friend, thank you so much. May God continue to bless you. For those of you in the audience, especially as we get close to the holidays we all celebrate, namely Christmas and Hanukkah, may God be with you. May He continue to prosper the work of all of our hands. Thanks for joining us.